Welcome, everyone. My name is Cindy Specht. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, the leading peer-directed national organization focusing on the two most prevalent mental health conditions, depression and bipolar disorder. Thank you for joining DBSA today and our esteemed presenter for our webinar on Treatment Choices, Part 1. Too often, individuals living with mood disorders can feel like their fate and quality of life is in the hands of others, that they have no real choice in finding the best path for treatment and ultimately their future. This can be disempowering and frustrating prospect that limits individuals' ability to achieve wellness goals that are most important to them. In reality, there's a number of choices that an individual can make that could have a significant impact on your treatment plan. The Treatment Choices 4-part webinar series, running from August through November, will explore how individuals can get back in the driver's seat on the road to wellness. Today's webinar, the first in this series, provides a broad overview of all the areas in which you can exercise choice in finding a treatment plan that works best for you, and how to work with your clinical team to ensure your treatment plan reflects those choices. Before we begin, I'd like to orient everyone on the flow for today's webinar and share some logistics. We'll be accepting written questions throughout the webinar and providing answers during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. To submit your question, type it into the questions box on your screen and hit enter on your keyboard or mouse and click the Submit button. Lastly, a reminder that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for online viewing on DBSA's website at dbsalliance.org/webinars approximately 1 week from today. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed presenter, Dr. Greg Simon. Greg Simon, MD, MPH, is a psychiatrist and researcher at Group Health Cooperative at the Center for Health Studies in Seattle. His research focuses on improving the quality and availability of mental health services for people living with mood disorders, and he has a specific interest in activating consumers to expect and demand more effective mental health care. DBSA is honored to also have Dr. Simon as the chair of our Scientific Advisory Board. I now give you Dr. Greg Simon.
Thanks very much, Cindy. And I want to thank DBSA for the opportunity to speak with all of you, and certainly want to acknowledge that although I am presenting this today, Cindy and colleagues at DBSA really are the overall architects of this program, which I strongly support. I'll also say that if you the beautiful visuals of the slides today are entirely Cindy's doing. All I can take credit for is putting the words into Cindy's overall design. So I want to give her credit and thank her for that as well. I'd encourage all of you to type in your questions as we go along. I hope that we'll get to as many of those today as we can, but I assure you that all of those questions are very important to us. And we use the questions you ask not just within this program, but those help to inform all of the programs we develop. The Ask the Doc columns in our newsletter each month and the other surveys that we have on the website. So even if we don't get to your question today, believe me, it will be read, and you'll probably see it appear sometime in DBSA programs over the coming months. So Cindy, do I have the, there we go. Well, that was just my picture. So as Cindy mentioned, what we're going to do today is to do a high-level overview about the kind of questions that people often encounter when they think about starting or continuing treatment for depression or bipolar disorder. This will be the high-level overview. We'll go through some things fairly quickly. We may have some time to get into some of your specific questions in detail at the end, but we are planning 3 more webinars over the coming months, and some of those will be able to go more deeply into specific questions about specific treatments for unipolar depression or specific treatments for bipolar disorder. I would start with an overall scheme in terms of thinking about what Cindy described as the wellness bouquet. All of the different parts that can make up an overall plan of care or an overall program of wellness for people who live with depression and bipolar disorder. Those include, I use the term medical or biological treatments. We used to use the term medications, but that's really a broader array of things now, so we use a somewhat broader term for that. Talk therapy or psychotherapy, support options, and by support options we mean how you get support from other people, lifestyle and personal strategies, things you may do every day, things you do to take care of yourself, those extra things you need to do at times when you feel you're having more trouble. And for most people, a personal wellness plan or a personal self-care plan is going to involve some component of all these, different things being more important for different people at different times. The key idea we're talking about today is that your plan is unique, that each person needs to, both by their experience and their preferences, to understand what works best for them. For each of us to say, this works best for me at this time, medications play this role in my treatment, counseling or psychotherapy plays this role, my physical exercise plays this role. And the combination of those things will be unique to each person based on what works for them, what they care about, and also may vary even from month to month or year to year. Start off talking about this idea of medical or biological treatments. And as I said, we think of that as a sort of broader now than just medications. There are a variety of prescribed medicines. And what you'll see here is when I talk about the names of these categories of medicines, the air quotes there are very intentional. There are medicines, we tend to use the name antidepressants, although actually they may help with a variety of things other than just depression. There are medicines that we used to call mood stabilizers, although they also may have a variety of effects, and that term is more tradition than scientific. And then a term that may be familiar to some of you, this idea of so-called atypical or second-generation antipsychotic medicine. And here those air quotes are especially important because even though we use the term antipsychotic, the most common use of those medicines today is for more severe depression or bipolar disorder, not for so-called psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. But when we think about medical or biological treatments, we also need to think about complementary and alternative treatments. And those include nutritional supplements, things you take, or what I would call somatic or body therapies, things you do like acupuncture, massage. And then a newer category, which is what broadens this into outside of just medical treatments, is what we call neuromodulation treatments. An odd term, but the terms that may be some more familiar to some of you are things like transcranial magnetic stimulation or vagal nerve stimulation or some of the new variations on that, many of which are still under development or experimental, but the idea of using electrical currents or magnetic fields to directly stimulate or change the activity of certain areas of the brain. So when we think about these different categories within the medical or biological treatments, start with the idea of prescribed medication. And I think one of the things that's very important when you think about prescribed medication, before you start to get into what medicine and what dose, is when is it a good idea for people to take medication to manage the symptoms of mood disorders? And how I would think about that and encourage you to sort of organize your thinking about that is that doctors and patients or consumers have different domains of expertise. The doctor is supposed to know some things. What the doctor is specifically supposed to know is what are the kinds of symptoms or problems that particular types of medications are supposed to help with. And as you describe symptoms or problems you're experiencing, the doctor is supposed to be thinking in her or his mind, are these the kinds of problems that this particular medicine seems to help with? The doctor is supposed to be able to give you some reasonable estimate of how likely it is that medicine will help with these kinds of things. And that estimate is based on what your doctor knows, based on her or his experience, and also what the research shows for many other people who've experienced similar problems. Doctors are especially supposed to know about what the likely side effects or possible risks of medications are. But patients or consumers are really the experts on certain things. Often the decision about taking medicine has to do with how big a problem is this. And how big a problem is this is a personal decision. It's not for a doctor to decide. And what it comes down to is how much do these particular symptoms or this problem interfere with my life? When you talk about risks or side effects, even though the doctor may be the best judge of the mathematical information, this medicine has a 20% chance of interfering with your sexual function, for instance. It's any individual patient or consumer who makes the decision, how important is that for me? And I use that example specifically because for some people interfering with sexual function may not be a major consideration, and for other people it may be a really important consideration that would tell you that medicine is just not an acceptable option. So that weighing the balance of possible benefits versus the risks or the side effects is something that patients or consumers are really the experts on. When we think about prescribed medication, the next question after is it worth taking medicine is what medicine should I take? And here I think it's possible, even when we're talking about very different categories of medications, to talk about some general principles. And I would start with the idea that there are averages and there are individuals. And if we look within any of these major groups of medicines, the antidepressant type medicines, the mood stabilizer type medicines, what we tend to find the research to show is, on the average, most of these medicines are generally similar in their effectiveness. That's certainly true for the different antidepressant medicines. Their average likelihood of being helpful is pretty similar. But it's also true that that varies widely from person to person. For any individual, the effects may be very different. So those of you who've heard me talk before know I like kind of goofy analogies, and the one I would use here is, if we have a ring of keys and we're looking at the door, what we can say is, on average, any one of those keys might work, but one of them is probably the right key for that door, and often the only way we're going to know is to try it. It's also true, the bad news is, that that individual variation is right now mostly unpredictable. There has been 40 or 50 years of research trying to say, how could we know which person is more likely to have a good effect of which medicine? And unfortunately, so far, that research has not been very helpful. We often end up making these decisions based more on the side effects than on the likely benefits, because the side effects are often more predictable. If we look, for instance, at antidepressant-type medicines, we often are able to say this medicine is more likely to cause these kinds of side effects, even if we can't say this medicine is more likely to be helpful for this particular group of people. What this means is that persistence is more important than genius. And what I mean by that is that the doctors are often not geniuses at saying what medicine will work, and in the absence of genius, we may often have to try one medicine. If that doesn't work out, try a different medicine. I hope that someday this story will be different. As I say to my patients every day, I hope that someday I have a little machine over in the corner of my office that people might be able to stick their heads in, and it would say what medicine they should take. Although if they did that, it would probably mean that most of my patients wouldn't need to come see me anymore and I wouldn't have a job. So maybe I shouldn't hope for that too vigorously right now. And then when we think about medicine, one of the key issues for me when starting medicine is, what are the questions that we need to think about, or what are the questions you'd really like to know the answer to before you leave the doctor's office? And what I would suggest is, if your doctor is talking to you about taking some medicine, during that visit or before you leave the office, you'd like to have pretty clear answers to questions like this. You'd like to know, do we have a common understanding about what problems this medicine is really supposed to help with? What is it that it's supposed to do? How are we going to measure whether that's actually helping? What questions will we ask that will tell us whether this medicine is having the good effects that we want it to have and not having the bad effects that we don't want it to have? When will we be able to tell that? Is this a medicine where we're likely going to be able to see the effects of it in 3 hours or 3 days or 3 weeks? Because if you and your doctor have a very different idea about when you're assessing the effects of this medicine, your communication about it is likely to be pretty confusing. What are the side effects or problems we should watch out for? And when is it likely that those kind of side effects or problems might show up? A few words about side effects. I think of this in sort of 2 different categories. Many of these medicines have what I would call their sort of ordinary or expected side effects. Those might be side effects like medicines causing upset stomach, or medicines causing you to feel jittery or shaky, or they're causing diarrhea. Usually these side effects are relatively mild. They're often not dangerous. And the question we ask about those side effects is, how bad is it? Is it getting better? Is it bad enough that this medicine is not worth continuing? It's important to know, though, that specific medicines can often have unexpected, uncommon, or even potentially dangerous side effects. That may happen. We'll talk about that some more in some of the later webinars and won't go into those details today. But the key thing when you think about side effects of medicine, and if you're starting a new medicine before you leave your doctor's office, what you want to know is, what are the likely problems that might happen, and what are the unlikely problems that might happen that I would really need to watch for and let you know about right away? Moving on from prescribed medications to complementary and alternative treatments, including nutritional supplements, what I would suggest to you is, you should probably think about various nutritional supplements or naturopathic remedies the same way you might think about prescribed medicine. Although some people may think of them as being in very different categories, I think from a practical sense the kind of questions that you want to ask are generally similar. You want to ask, what's the evidence for the effectiveness of this particular supplement or homeopathic treatment or naturopathic treatment for this particular problem or symptom? I think it's not helpful to think about this in global or general terms. So if we look at the evidence, what we can see, for instance, and today in this webinar we won't go into an exhaustive list, I just put those up there for illustrative examples. S-adenosylmethionine, now made known to some of you as SAMe, a nutritional supplement, has good evidence for its effectiveness as a treatment for depression. It does not have good evidence for its effectiveness as a treatment for bipolar disorder. While St. John's wort, also known as hypericum, does have evidence for its effectiveness for depression, but there is even evidence it sometimes caused manic symptoms in people who have bipolar disorder. While omega-3 fatty acids, often found in fish oil, people may know it by that name, have some evidence that they help both in terms of treating depression and bipolar disorder. So just like for prescribed medicines, we wouldn't ask the question, is this a good pill? We would ask the question, is this a good pill for this particular problem or symptom? We'd ask about nutritional supplements, not just, is this a good supplement, but is this a good supplement for people who are experiencing this particular kind of problem? We'd also certainly always ask, what are the potential side effects or risks of those treatments? And does this particular supplement or homeopathic or naturopathic treatment have any potential interaction with other prescribed medicines? When we think about complementary and alternative medicines, I'd also think about what I sort of put in the category of somatic or body type therapies. And these include things like chiropractic, massage, or acupuncture. If we look at the evidence for those treatments, I think here we can tell a somewhat different story overall than we told for nutritional supplements. There is not clear evidence that any of those somatic or body therapies are specifically effective for treatment of mood disorders, either unipolar depression or bipolar disorder. For massage therapy and for acupuncture, there is some evidence of their effectiveness for anxiety, and many people who live with mood disorders also experience anxiety. So in the same way I would think about what medicines are effective for what problems, I would think about these somatic or bodily therapies as what particular problems can they be effective for. These treatments generally do not have significant risks or adverse effects. But what I mean by that last point on that slide, these as being complementary rather than alternative, is I would be hesitant to recommend chiropractic, acupuncture, or massage as the primary treatments for people who have more severe depression or bipolar disorder. I would think of them as complementary treatments, things that might be helpful in addition to other sorts of treatments. But relying on them as a primary treatment for a more severe problem, I couldn't in good conscience recommend, because we really don't have very good evidence about their effectiveness. The last category of these medical or biological treatments are what we would call neuromodulation treatments. These are a variety of terms that may be familiar to some of you, although some of them are relatively uncommon. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is the use of a magnet, a strong magnet, that's put on the surface of the skull, which directly stimulates areas of the brain. Direct current stimulation similarly is an electrical current that's applied to the outside, to the skin, to the surface, to directly stimulate areas of the brain. Vagus nerve stimulation is an internal stimulation. There's an actual surgery where a machine is implanted that stimulates the vagus nerve, which passes back up into the brain. And direct brain stimulation, which is still just an experimental treatment, or direct current stimulation, is a treatment where an electrode is implanted in the brain. The original, of course, neuromodulation treatment was ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, previously called shock therapy. Although these treatments vary widely in terms of their potential adverse effects or their negative effects, the general idea of all of them is the same: to directly affect the functioning of the brain through an electrical or a magnetic stimulation. When we think about Trying to get my slides to advance. There we go. Okay. When we think about this range, there we go. When we think about this range of neuromodulation treatments, I would summarize the way we think about those as follows. At this point, we do not think about any of these treatments as initial or first-line treatments of depression. If we look at the evidence, and also if we look at what the Food and Drug Administration has officially approved some of these treatments for, we generally think of them as treatments that might be used when more conventional normal treatments, especially antidepressant medications, have not been effective. We think of them as second or third line treatments. It's also important to realize that, like medication, none of these treatments appear to have any permanent benefit or permanent effect. In the same way that taking antidepressant medicine to help with depression doesn't have a permanent effect. The medicine works as long as you take it. It stops working sometime, usually within a few weeks after taking it. All of these other treatments, like transcranial magnetic stimulation or vagus nerve stimulation, work when they are being used, but don't continue to work if they're no longer used. The overall story about these treatments, and I think if we look at what's happened over the last 10, 15 years in the development of new treatments, the hope has been, is there some treatment that has the powerful antidepressant effect of ECT without the negative effects of ECT? It is true that ECT for people with very severe depression is probably the most effective treatment, and it is also true that it has significant risks and side effects. Unfortunately, some of these treatments, like transcranial magnetic stimulation, for instance, which was originally hoped to be like ECT without the bad effects, I think at this point we would have to say is probably not as powerful or as strong a treatment. So, when we're considering any of these treatments, whether it's medication, a nutritional supplement, or even a treatment like transcranial magnetic stimulation, the key question we have to think about is, how and when do we decide if this treatment is really helping? And my sort of, joking response here is, unfortunately at this time it's a little bit more like Marco Polo to those of you whose kids play this or played this when you were little. That's the game where, one kid says Marco with his eyes closed and the other kids say Polo, and the kid who has his eyes closed is trying to reach around and find the others. It's a little like Marco Polo because the kid with his eyes closed is always saying, what direction am I trying to go in? And as I listen to those other kids' voices, am I getting closer or farther away? Often what happens when we're evaluating these treatments is that patients or consumers come into their doctor's office and the doctor says, are things better or worse? And if we haven't been keeping track of that, it might be hard to say. So now I'm going to make a strong pitch to those of you who are listening is, we have better tools now. And a really nice example of that is the DBSA Wellness Tracker that's available online and available as a mobile app. And you can see a picture of that here to those of you who aren't familiar with it. One part of the DBSA Wellness Tracker includes a space where people can identify what kind of symptoms or problems are most important to them, can keep track of those on a daily or possibly weekly basis, and can use that information at every visit with a doctor who might be prescribing one of those treatments to help you and your doctor figure out, are we really moving in the right direction here? So I want to recommend that all to you highly if you haven't seen it already. Moving on to the other main category of treatments that you get from professionals, counseling or psychotherapy. One of the first questions is, does psychotherapy work? And the short answer is yes. We know very clearly for depression, psychotherapy is often as effective as antidepressants for moderate depression, and for people who experience more severe or chronic depression, there's strong evidence that psychotherapy and medication together is more effective than either one of those alone. We have more recent but still good evidence that psychotherapy is effective for people who live with bipolar disorder. We know that for people who live with bipolar disorder experiencing depression, psychotherapy is effective, it does help, and that specific psychotherapy programs can help to prevent recurrences or relapses of mania among people who live with bipolar disorder. These days, when you think about psychotherapy, you think about initials. And I want to go through this. Some of these initials may be familiar to you. There is CBT, stands for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. behavioral activation, known as BA, a new variation, MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, PST, problem-solving therapy, DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, IPT, interpersonal therapy, and a new variation on that, IPSRT, or social rhythm therapy. The reason for this alphabet soup is, I think we have learned over the last 15 to 20 years, the same you could think of as with medicine, that for psychotherapy there are specific active ingredients, and that's what each of these letters stands for. You might say each of these letters represents one of the possible active ingredients, whether that active ingredient is cognitive, focused on thoughts, behavior, focused on scheduling positive activities, problem solving, mindfulness. So each of these therapies combines those different active ingredients in some new combination. But when you think about selecting a therapy and selecting a therapist, you want to think about the right kind of therapy and the right therapist or person you're working with. The right therapy is about focusing on the problems that really matter to you. Certain kinds of therapies, cognitive therapy, focuses on dealing with recurrent negative or upsetting thoughts. So cognitive therapy could be the right kind of therapy if that's a problem you most want help with. Interpersonal therapy focuses on becoming more effective in interpersonal relationships. So that's where you want to focus if that's what matters to you. Also, we're thinking about therapy that takes advantage of your own personal strengths. Some people, the way I would think of it, are word people. Therapies like cognitive therapy that focus on words and talking, writing things down, are helpful to them. Some people really may be more physically focused people, so that mindfulness-based techniques focused on physical relaxation may be more helpful. It's important to understand how your own mind works, what your mind's strengths are, and how you can build on those strengths to take best advantage of counseling or therapy. And also therapy that fits with your values. Different things may be more important to you in terms of what you want to accomplish. Besides the therapy, there is the therapist. And even if you looked at different therapists who all say they do the same kind of therapy, those of you who've seen different therapists know, if you've seen one therapist, you've seen one therapist. Therapists have different styles. It's important to understand what style works better for you. A therapist who is more talkative, a therapist who's quieter. It's also practical considerations also matter. No therapist is the best therapist if they have no appointments available at a time you can go, and no therapist is the best therapist if the price is completely out of your range. These days insurance may have a lot to do with that, so you may need to consider which therapists are in the network or in the panel that's covered by your health insurance. When you're looking for a therapist and a therapy, here's my suggestion about the kind of things that you might want to look for. Do you and your therapist agree about what you're working on? If your therapist thinks you're working on one thing and you think you're working on another, then that may not be the right therapist for you, or that may at least be an important area where you need to come together and clarify. But agreement about common goals when we look at what predicts success or good results from psychotherapy is always the most important. Does your therapist have an explanation for what's going on that makes sense to you? If you are really more understanding your current problem as an interpersonal problem and your therapist is understanding it as a cognitive problem, that may not be helpful to you. And you need to ask your therapist, how do you understand this problem, and see if that explanation makes sense to you and resonates with what's going on with you. It's important to have a plan with your therapist for when and how you'll decide if it's helping. When you leave that first visit, do we have a plan about scheduling a certain number of visits, about when we'll evaluate this and how we'll evaluate this to decide if we want to keep going with it? And ideally, specific things that you would work on between visits. What those specific things would be would, of course, depend on the particular kind of therapy that you and your therapist are working on. Those might be exercises focused on your thoughts. They might be exercises focused on physical relaxation. They might be homework focused on your daily schedule. But whatever it is, a clear idea that there's something that you are doing in between visits that's going to help you make progress, and that's part of the program you and your therapist are working on. I would also give you here my list of, when you're seeing a therapist, what I'd say what to look out for. The sort of classical version of therapy on one extreme is the therapist who just nods their head and says, and then at the end of 50 minutes says it's time to stop. People who've experienced that kind of therapy often find it frustrating and unhelpful, and I think what we've learned from psychotherapy research over the last 15 years is that that kind of therapy is often not helpful. But at the other extreme, the therapist who jumps in and tells you what to do before understanding your situation, or instantly begins to give you advice about situations that they probably don't know that much about, that other extreme is to be avoided as well. And then my third point here, when I say blame dealing, what I mean by that is a therapist who's all about whose fault it is, whether it's the fault of your spouse, your partner, your parents, or in the worst case, your own fault. What we know about effective therapy is effective therapy focuses on specific things that you can do to make progress, not so much on who we might blame for how we got into this fix in the first place. So I'm going to shift again and now talk about that third part of the wellness bouquet, which is support system. That support system ideally is diverse. It would include family and or friends. It would include peer support, which might be organized peer support through an organization like DBSA, or informal peer support. It might include for many people a faith or spiritual community, or other communities of interest. And by communities of interest, I mean people you might share interest in any other activity, ranging from book groups to quilting to genealogy, but people with whom you have a bond and a shared interest that where you can derive some mutual support. Thinking about support, I'll use a few jargon terms here, but I think it's sometimes helpful to think about different kinds of support. What we sometimes in the psychology business refer to as instrumental support, somebody who can give you concrete help when you need it. There may be time when you need a ride to get to the grocery store, or you need someone to help drive you to a doctor visit. That's different from emotional support, someone who listens, who can empathize, who can be encouraging. Or slightly different from emotional support is just companionship, someone you can do things with. You don't necessarily have to talk about what's upsetting or bothersome. You may be doing some totally unrelated activity, someone you can spend time with in a comfortable way. And then respite, which is maybe a form of instrumental support, but someone who can help you in a way that gives you a temporary break from something that's stressful. I bring out these different kinds of support because it's worth understanding that different people may be able to help you in different ways. There may be people who are marvelous at giving instrumental support, always there to help you, give you a ride somewhere, but they get really uncomfortable when you talk to them about how you're feeling. On the other hand, there may be people who can talk for hours, but if you need a ride somewhere or something concrete like that, they're not very reliable. We all have our strengths and weaknesses. We all have those things we like to do more or like to do less, or can do more easily because of our life circumstance. So when you're thinking about building your support system, or thinking about what kind of support you need on any particular day, it might be helpful to use that scheme to say, what kind of support is it that I need? Who is the person or who are the people who might be able to provide that for me? And then if I can, to make a specific request. Ask for what you need right now. Ask for, I can't get to the doctor tomorrow and I have an appointment early in the morning, can you give me a ride? Or ask for, I'm feeling really upset about something and I need to talk about it right now. Or you can ask for, I'm going through a bad time, I need to get out of the house and go on a walk. I don't want to talk about what's bothering me, I just need to be with somebody right now. Can we do that? It may seem awkward at first, but the more specific you can be, the more likely you are to get the help you need. And of course, most of all, if it works, be sure to say thank you. When you're building your support system, it's important for your healthcare providers, doctors and therapists, to understand who is in your support system and how they can help. Your doctors or therapists might especially want to know who might they call if they're not able to reach you. Very important these days, given all the laws and regulations, what kind of information are they allowed to share with what people in your life? And if there were ever a time when you weren't really able to speak for yourself about what your preferences are, who are the right people to be able to speak for you? And then finally on to the fourth part of this wellness bouquet, which is personal wellness strategies. And my sort of very simple scheme for thinking about that is your personal wellness strategies include what are the things you want to do more of, what are the things you'd like to do less of, and then what are the extra special things that you might need to call on or rely on when you need more help. When we think about things you need to do more of, I'd say the bad news is your grandmother was right all along. It really does help to get regular physical exercise, to eat your fruits and vegetables, and to keep a regular sleep schedule. I don't want to be too flippant about it, but the point is that the basics of good self-care is not rocket science. It's mostly things that all of us know, that people have long known. The struggle is to do them. The hard thing is, how do you do those things, and how do you do those things day after day that we know are helpful? When we think about the less of things, this is not rocket science either. The things that we want to do less of often are to use less alcohol, to use less marijuana and other drugs, to eat less of calorie-dense or fatty foods, and to not sleep during the daytime. The difficult thing is all of these things we often ask people to do less of are things that many of us often feel like doing when we're not doing well. The problem is because many of these are things which may, at least in the very short run, over a few minutes to a few hours, provide some temporary or imperfect relief, even if they do really interfere with our wellness in the long run. There we go. And then finally, besides those general what to do more of and what to do less of, you want to think about your own personal wellness routines, the things that for you individually are most helpful, the things you want to make sure you schedule to do every day, including the people you want to spend more time with, making time for some spiritual practice or restorative time in your day. So the daily routine is, each day I want to try to do more of this. These are the things I would hope to avoid. These are the specific things I want to plan for. And then finally, in that personal self-care or wellness plan is what I would call a booster plan. One point that may sound like a little bit hair-splitting, but I always like to use the term booster plan instead of crisis plan or emergency plan. There are two reasons why I like the term booster plan better. First, it's good to use your booster strategies before it becomes a crisis or an emergency. But second, when you're having trouble, sometimes the words crisis and emergency are not very friendly or reassuring terms. Sometimes one of the first things we need to say when we're feeling in a crisis is, this is not a crisis. So I like the term booster plan because booster plan is about when do you need an extra boost or when do you need extra help. The key ingredients of a booster plan are what warning signs you feel like you need to look out for to let you know, and then what are some specific activities you need to do and specific things that help you with specific problems. You might want to think of that in terms of, if I'm feeling slowed down, low in energy, deactivated, what things help me to get energized? Or if I'm feeling overstimulated, over-energized, over-agitated, what things help me to slow down or calm down? Your booster plan might include what people you need to spend more time with and even what people you need to spend more time with when you're feeling certain ways, and might include information about when and how you might want to contact your healthcare providers. I'll once again here put in an endorsement for the DBSA Wellness Tracker. In addition to places to tracking particular symptoms, it also includes places for you to track wellness and wellness goals and some positive strategies that you want to be pursuing. So in summary, all of these different parts of the wellness bouquet, medical or medical or biological type treatments, talk therapy or psychotherapy, peer support, and then your own personal self-care or wellness strategies. These are all things that you will need to think about making your own plan for, to think about how those different things might help you at different times and situations, and to be ready to change that plan as time goes by. A few closing words about working effectively with your healthcare providers. I think it's easy to lose track of when you're working with a doctor or a therapist, to lose track of who's the boss. And it's important to remember you are the boss. Your providers really are working for you, so they should act like that. And if it seems to you that they're not acting like that, that should be a time for speaking up, or a time to think about, do you have other options? But you always can expect them to tell you the truth. So a provider, acting like you are the boss does not mean they may never say things that you would prefer not to hear. It may actually mean sometimes they would say things that you prefer not to hear. And we shouldn't expect providers to encourage or participate in things that hurt you. So being the boss doesn't say that your provider would say it's fine to drink as much alcohol as you want if you think that's what's right for you. Your provider may at times need to say, I actually know from my medical experience that that's harmful to you, even if it doesn't seem that way. And then as we talked about, when we talked about medicine, but I want to reiterate this point in general, when we think about who's the expert. Your providers are supposed to be the experts about averages, but you are really the expert about you. You're the expert about your own individual experience. How can you make it easy for your providers? I think at each visit when you go in, it'd be important to have in your mind, what kind of a visit is this in general? And to even say that right up front. Am I in a real crisis place right now and we need to focus on that? Is this just sort of a routine checkup because this plan is working okay and we want to keep going with it? Or are we somewhere in between those two? What's the decision we're trying to make today? Are we trying to decide whether this treatment is working? Are we trying to decide if this treatment is even necessary anymore and maybe I could taper off this medicine or discontinue this treatment? And what information do we need to make that decision? What's the particular information the doctor or therapist brings to that decision? What's the information or expertise you bring to that decision? And how do you bring those different pieces of information together to come up with the best choice? And finally, a sort of maybe almost philosophical comment about, in this relationship with your doctor, about truth-telling and blaming. I think things often go off track when people feel like they can't really tell the truth to their doctor because they're worried about being blamed about things. And I remember in one of our support groups here, one of the support groups I always remember was one when the discussion came up about people saying, is it ever a good idea to lie to your doctor? And people told stories about times when they felt like they couldn't tell their doctor the truth because they felt like they might be blamed, they felt like the doctor might be angry with them. And the answer that one of our support group members came up with, Ian, which I thought was an absolutely beautiful answer, which is, it might be a good idea to lie to your doctor only once, because if this is a doctor you have to lie to over and over again, you probably need to get a new doctor, or you probably need to work it out with this doctor so you can tell him the truth next time. So my parting words to you is, if you ever find yourself in that situation where you feel like you can't tell the truth, that should be a reason for some significant reassessment. That's the end of the prepared remarks. I just wanted to encourage you to refer to some of the resources we talked about. And I think that Cindy's going to come back on now, and we'll see if we have any questions that we want to take.
We do. We actually have some really great questions that have been submitted, so I encourage everyone to stay on board for that. I do want to cover a couple of quick items, though, for individuals in case they needed to duck out early, but this will only take a minute. So we talked about the idea here that we have some resources available both from DBSA and from others. You can find that on dbsalliance.org and or dbsalliance.org/resources. I'm actually going to take back the keyboard, Greg. And then I wanted to remind everybody this will be archived. The PowerPoint is currently available to be downloaded from this location, and the archive webinar will be available to be seen online for within the next week. We will be distributing, you will be receiving a post-webinar survey. We really hope you'll be able to provide us some feedback about today's survey. It'll be emailed to you, and you'll also be able to submit, we'd like to get your feedback on topics or critical treatment choice points that you'd like to see covered in our upcoming webinars in October on treatment choices for depression, treatment choices for bipolar disorder. Those are those two, and we want to take the moment right now real quickly before we open it up to questions to thank everyone. We want to thank Dr. Simon for his time and expertise. We'd also like to thank Synovian for their generous support for the presentation of this webinar, or the production, and we'd like to thank you, our peers and partners, for joining us today. We really do hope that you found the webinar helpful, and we hope we can make these better by getting your feedback in the survey that'll be emailed to you. And if you're interested in not only the Treatment Choices webinars that are coming up, but all webinars or events that we have coming, please log on to or check dbsalliance.org/webinars and or join our mailing list so that you can learn about future DBSA webinars and events. So at this point, we are going to open the Q&A section up. I shouldn't say open it. I'm actually going to share a couple of the questions from our listeners. We have one question here that was, how do you implement shared decision-making in the process of treatment choices?
Well, shared decision-making, a term that may be familiar to you, I think is very similar to the things I was talking about. You know, it's the idea that patients or consumers and healthcare providers make shared decisions. You know, the one thing that you know, I often say when I talk to doctors about this question, because, you know, doctors often think shared decision-making means, well, doctors make decisions and they'll let patients share in that a little. What doctors don't realize mostly is that their patients make all the important decisions. So shared decision-making shouldn't be so much doctors saying to patients, I'll let you participate in this. It is more doctors asking their patients, would you allow me to work with you about some of these important decisions you're making? You'll notice that in the webinar today, most of the things we talked about are not decisions made in the doctor's office. They're decisions people make every day in terms of what keeps them healthy. But this idea of shared decision-making is very much along the idea of doctors are supposed to know some facts. Doctors are supposed to be experts on certain facts and to be able to communicate that in a way that's useful to people. And patients or consumers are the experts on values and their own experience and what matters to them. So to use the example that I gave you, you know, shared decision-making would be something like a doctor saying, well, if you took this medicine, it's less likely to cause it's less likely to interfere with your sexual function, but it's more likely to cause you to gain weight. The patient or consumer's role in that would be to either say, I care a lot more about weight gain than I care about my sexual function, so I'm choosing option A. Or the next person to say, I care a lot more about my sexual function than I care about weight gain, so I'm choosing option B. It is the patient's choice there. It's very clear that the patient is making the choice. What the doctor is contributing is some specific facts.
Okay, great. We have another question. One individual is afraid if they tell their psychiatrist and social worker that they sometimes smoke pot, that they're actually afraid to do that because they're afraid they won't continue giving them their medicine, or they might report them or something. Do you have any suggestions on that?
Well, you know, I live in the state of Washington where everybody smokes marijuana legally now, so I guess I have a somewhat different perspective on that. But I guess I need to remember it's still a crime in many parts of the United States of America. Well, I guess I'd answer that in two ways. One is a specific thing about what do we know about marijuana and how it affects people with mood disorders. And the other is not specific to marijuana, but this general issue about being afraid to talk to your doctor about something you do, which isn't just with marijuana. What we know about marijuana is that, you know, marijuana can be a risky thing for some people. Especially we know for younger people who have a family history of bipolar disorder, marijuana can have a destabilizing influence and can increase risk of serious either bipolar disorder or developing psychosis. So I think there are some risks people need to be aware of. It is true also that some medications can interact with marijuana, so it'd be important if you're using marijuana for your doctor to know that. You know, this question about, you know, is it ever a good, you know, is it ever a good idea to lie to your doctor gets back to exactly what you're talking about, which is, will I be blamed? Will I be shamed? Will my doctor reject me? If that were to happen, that might be a sign that you'd need to find a new doctor. I hope, you know, if your doctor were to tell you, so for instance, if one of my patients told me that they were drinking, say, you know, 4 or 5 drinks a night, I would certainly feel I need to tell them the likelihood is that that's maybe contributing to anxiety and depression problems. It certainly isn't helping, and for most people that's making things worse. Obviously, when it comes to things like advising people about using alcohol or marijuana, doctors can't force anything to happen. And so having an honest discussion so that your doctor can share their concerns is a really important thing. I guess that's my long-winded way of saying I think it's more likely in the long run to help you by keeping that a secret. Sorry, I mean the long run likely to hurt you by keeping that a secret. Yeah.
Okay, that was a surprise. I was like, okay.
Yeah.
Someone asked, could you give a case or an example of when neuromodulation therapy was appropriate, and what were the warning signs that it was appropriate?
Well, if we go, and we'll probably want to go into this in one of our other webinars, but for instance, transcranial magnetic stimulation is, if we look at the research evidence and we look at what the FDA has officially approved, it's approved as a treatment for people who've tried at least 2 antidepressant medicines and they haven't worked. And for that group of people, it does seem to be helpful. And that's officially where it has been approved. Vagus nerve stimulation has been studied for people who have, I would say, the jargon term we would use is even somewhat more treatment-resistant depression, so people who've tried even more antidepressant medicines and they haven't worked, and that's the specific group of people for whom that's been approved. In those situations, those treatments, transcranial magnetic stimulation or vagus nerve stimulation, are not the only treatments, but they are reasonable treatments. But as I said, I don't think any of us would say that if someone is coming in, considering that as the very first treatment they would try for depression, I think most experts would not recommend that. And actually, that's in that situation, we would even officially have to say it's not approved by the FDA for use in that situation.
Okay. We have another question about how should a provider appropriately respond to a patient sharing symptoms of suicidal ideation?
Yeah. Where I work at Group Health, we've had a really big change about this over the last few years, because I think, we got into a situation, which is true, I think, in a lot of mental health clinical treatment settings, where people, our patients or consumers, were often reluctant to share that information. Providers sometimes may have been even afraid to ask because they were afraid it would turn into a very difficult or contentious situation. What we've started doing is to say we need to ask everyone at every visit some basic questions about having thoughts about self-harm. If people say they have those thoughts, we need to ask them specific questions about how frequent those thoughts are, how intense they are, whether people feel like that they need to be able to resist them. And if people are having thoughts like that, we need to talk to them about, and we like to try to think of this these days not as a control issue but a safety issue. So we ask people questions, for instance, like, have you ever stored up pills that you might use to hurt yourself? Do you have access to firearms? And if people have those things, pills that they've stored up, if they have access to firearms, we talk about, do you think you really should have those things in your house? Because if you're having those kind of thoughts, having those things in your house puts you at more risk. We also want to talk about where and how you might get help if you feel like those thoughts are getting stronger. Who are the specific people you might contact? Who are the people who might be helpful? So the more we can move to the sort of getting specific about that, turning it into a problem that we're working on together, and really trying to turn it into a safety issue. What are the things that make you safer, and what are the things that make you less safe?
Okay. We have someone that has some questions regarding ETC. So they shared that after some serious suicidal attempts in the past year, the hospital suggests ECT. The person tried it and it helped, but they got tired of it sometimes and stopped, then experienced suicidal ideation again and ended up back in the hospital getting another series of ETC. They've now had 3 series and are maintenance treatments, and it's helping. They're still on medicines as well, and they're doing talk therapy too. But the question is, will the occasional suicidal thoughts ever stop being in this person's head, and in any degree? And will ECT help with that?
Well, it's a very individual question, so I'm not sure I could give a general answer. But probably the general answer I would give is Certainly there are some people for whom ECT is a very effective treatment. I've certainly seen people for whom it was remarkably effective. I have to, be completely honest. I've also seen people for whom it was ineffective. But it is true that ECT is not permanently effective. ECT, like even like medication, it may be very effective, but it wears off after a while. Ideally, we don't think of people getting ECT as a long-term treatment. And most people who get ECT, when it helps, will then typically take some type of antidepressant medicine after that, and the antidepressant medicine will work well enough to keep things in a stable or reasonable place. For some people, it does happen that depression gets worse again, and they return and get ECT again. It rarely happens that people get ECT on an ongoing basis. ECT, when it's given as a sort of acute treatment, is typically 2 to 3 times per week. Rarely people will get ECT periodically, once every few weeks or once a month. But that's something we try to reserve for only when it's absolutely necessary. And the hope, as I said, for some of these other treatments like transcranial magnetic stimulation or vagus nerve stimulation is that they would be able to do what ECT does without some of the downsides of getting ECT. Now, there are some people who get ECT and don't experience a lot of downsides. They don't experience memory loss problems or ongoing confusion, but those are significant issues for some people.
Another person asked, Greg, kind of shares that their doctor's a really big believer in polytherapy, and they're currently trying sometimes very large combinations of medicines, but has noticed that other doctors seem quite hostile to that prospect, stating that they're taking too many medicines. Person themselves kind of expressed this idea of like they don't really understand how a single pill or even 2 could help, but acknowledges that the problem is that the side effects pile up, and sometimes it is hard to tell what's doing what. That you have to move slowly and add one thing at a time. What is do you have any statements or comments regarding polytherapy?
Well, one thing I think all doctors and all patients or consumers would agree with is the best amount of medicine to take is the least amount that really works. So I don't think anyone wants to take unnecessary medicine or medicine that's not helpful. And no one, if they were doing really well, would say, let's just add another medicine just for the purpose of adding another medicine. Most people who take multiple medicines end up taking multiple medicines because they were taking one medicine and it didn't work, or they were taking 2 medicines and they didn't work. The difficult question is always, if one medicine doesn't work and you start taking a second medicine, do you try to get rid of the first one? I think that's a case-by-case individual person decision. If a medicine seemed completely ineffective, and we're more often we will move to a different medicine. If a medicine seemed partially effective, we may say let's keep that while adding a second medicine. The other difficult thing is as the years go by, medicines accumulate, and there may be times when you say, have we looked at this in a while? Are we really clear this medicine is actually producing benefit, and do the benefits outweigh the side effects? So I think there does need to be that sort of periodic reassessment of, do we really know what this medicine is doing? Sometimes when you're taking a medicine, especially if you're taking more than one medicine on a long-term basis, it can be hard to know that. I have to say, on the scale of doctors who like for people to take multiple medicines at once and doctors who like to keep things simple, I am probably more on the keep things simple side of the scale. But I'd be the first to admit it's not that there's powerful scientific evidence that that's better. It's maybe just a matter of my own personal style or preference.
Okay. Well, we have time for one more question. And it's I'm sure a very common question. The person asked, can you ask a doctor to help you pro bono? They don't have any insurance, money, or a job right now. And they need help with agoraphobia, PTSD, and anxiety with major depression. What do you think?
Well, I mean, doctors, the world of medicine is complicated. Ranging from doctors who are in solo private practice where all decisions are their own, and they could decide to waive fees, they could decide to see people at a reduced rate, to sometimes doctors who work for big companies who have no say in the matter. The doctor isn't the one who sends out the bills, it's the big clinic that they work for who sends out the bills. I think, depending on if you're in that situation, it's not that it's not possible, but you need to ask the right person. If your doctor is, practicing on their own, that's a question you can always ask, and some doctors are, certainly willing to do that. If you're being seen at some large clinic where the individual doctor doesn't have any say, most actually big organizations, big hospitals or healthcare systems, actually they may not publicize it, but have a legal requirement to provide some level of uncompensated or free care. So they often have programs, and you have to ask.
Okay, well, we are right exactly at 7 p.m. Central Time. So we're going to be closing up the webinar. I want to say thank you again to Greg, to our sponsors for this webinar, Synovian, and to all of you listening and being with us. We hope that you'll join us again for part 2 related to treatment choices for depression, part 3, which would be an option for treatment choices for bipolar disorder, and our summary in terms of tools that can help you make an analysis regarding your treatment choices. So stay tuned for more, and thank you so much for being with us all here today. Take care, everyone.